time and in this land as it exists with our neighbors and their interests. So a lot of it is not by our own volition, not by our own will, but because we need to compromise and we need to find a way to maintain the integrity of our beliefs in light of where the communities are going and how they're developing. And it's either that or we see the kind of belligerence that is occurring across the border and what they're doing overseas and some of those issues. So we don't want to live in a world like that. We want to live in a world that is peaceful and harmonious and helpful to one another. It's a give and take that we think about as we come into these spaces. So today, I'm just going to share a couple of things, but I want to begin with a smudge and a prayer. In our tradition, we always begin with prayer. We always begin with some understanding of our relationship to the Creator. In our spirituality and our religion of the Indigenous people, it's always centered around who we call Wakantaka. And like the Hebrew people, we don't have a name for God. We're merely calling God the great mystery or the Creator or something that we don't understand, something in the mix that kind of gives us a connection to all that is going on as we learn from creation. What's that?
It's a mic for the Facebook.
Oh.
We put it on.
Wow. Yeah. Let's go here. A little frazzle from the travel, so we will begin. This is a gathering of medicinal plants and herbs from the mountains that we use in our smudges. The Stoney people have different types of smudges that are proprietary to their families, and so they use certain things in mixture for their blessings. The smudge is a purification. It is like incense that we have in the Catholic Church or other types of faiths that use this purification ceremony to help and to bring us into accord with creation. The studies around the use of sweetgrass and sage in burning them and in purifying air have been scientifically proven, and that this actually does do what we say it does. We understood that. So we offer our prayer and our observance of this tradition. We do this because oftentimes in our history, this has been banned, this has been demonized, this has been misinterpreted as some other kind of worship. We don't understand why we do this or what we're doing when we offer a smudge in prayer. So we bring this with part of the tradition to restore that tradition and also to honor our ancestors and their practices. So let us pray. Yogi Shigino Kanash, Nishigiri, Modademanch, Shnish. Adema Kochigar, Inegi Pavichosina. Mahena Injakya, Agene Inegi Pavichosina. Anokine Nichakya, Agenish Inegi Pavichosina. Yaitaya, Nachaya, Inegi Pavichosina. Alhamdulillah. Wednesday, Chagya Nagadish Chastatan, Tangacha. Again, Indigenous Publishers. Foi de Indigenous Publishers. Ina na Kochi. Indigenous Publishers. David Kuchiger. Indigenous Publishers. This prayer is a 4 directions prayer. My father prayed one of his final prayers before he passed away in 2006. He was not only a minister, reverend in the United Church, but also a practitioner in more traditional ways. And he observed that throughout his life, the pipe and the different ceremonies that we have. So we give thanks for those lessons and that passing on of tradition, because those help us in our work today. Those help us to find balance and instruction, guidance, and a lot of ingenuity that they had to live with in dealing with very difficult circumstances. He was an individual who, in his training, grew up in a very traditional manner, but in becoming a minister, he had to travel to the United States, to Arizona. There was a native seminary in Tempe, Arizona, where he learned, and he became part of the Presbyterian church down there, still part of the United Church. The Morley people built the United Church, the first church in southern Alberta, and continued to practice with the Methodist tradition, and then with the United Church in 1925, 100 years. They were there at the beginning. And it was always a welcome thing in our community. They weren't resistant to Christianity or to Christian teaching. I think a lot of times what we hear from our elders is that we just wish they were a little more honest or following what their guidebook of the Bible was saying about these things, so that we could have a more honest discussion about God and about our relationship with one another in creation. I'm going to pass this around with a smudge, especially with the Stoney tradition. We don't mandate that you have to do it a certain way. There's no right or wrong way for us to do this. So we would put it over our head or over our heart, over our body. Any way that one receives this blessing can help to bring us into accord together. So I'm just going to pass this around. You can smudge or you can pass it along. One of the things, because we were, since the after the missionary period, because we were forced to endure Christian teaching and assimilation and forced to abide by those teachings, we do not inflict that spiritual violence on anyone else. We always believe that people have a way to God, and that way is their way. We cannot tell people how to believe. My father, in one of his talks about how we never told one another, if you're worshiping in this way, if you're doing this, if you're doing a smudge, if you're offering a deer's heart, if you're praying to a certain plant and certain things are what you're doing, that's your way. And we don't say you're praying wrong, you're doing it wrong. Much like Christians in Europe, through the Inquisition and other things, mandate that you have to do it in a certain way, otherwise you're
committing blasphemy or a heretic, you're an apostate to the faith. So we don't inflict that to each other. And that was true even before Christianity, because we all had different faiths, different traditions, different religious practices in this land, and we respected one another. One of the important things about these areas in the Cypress Hills, that's considered like our Jerusalem. It's a very important place for the Assiniboine people. And I'm from the Assiniboine Dakota-speaking people. And that area was open to all people. We don't control areas. We don't claim areas in that way. We don't claim territory. But if we were in that area, that's a place where we practice our most sacred ceremonies. It would be a large gathering place for people. If others came, like the Blackfoot, they would come and they would want to do their ceremony there, their Sundance. It would be left for them to do what they're going to do. They wouldn't be attacked while they were there. They would be respected for their practices. And so we wouldn't go and try to convince one another or evangelize to each other that this is the proper way, this is the proper belief. So that is very different from what we see overseas, in the Middle East, in the Holy Land, where they have the tomb of Abraham. It's half in a mosque and half in a synagogue. So they've split the body right in half and created two separate faiths, two separate buildings where that body resides. And so that kind of thing is anathema to how we believe, how we understand the world. We don't force one another to believe what we believe. If what they believe is wrong or what they believe is problematic, it will come out in time. It's how you follow God. If God intended you to follow a particular path, that's your path. We cannot countermand what God is doing. So that's our deeper theological foundation, is that we are accepting of everyone. In the United Church, we talk about inclusion, and we have affirming and reconciliation programs, but not everybody in those churches abide by that. We have in Alberta, I think it was 2020 when we did the AGM in Lethbridge. I'm not sure that's the right year. But one of the things they asked was how many of the churches in the region were affirming, were LGBTQ friendly and supporting of that. And out of the 90 churches, it was something like 15, 16. And so it wasn't a huge thing. It's now, there's now more, but still, even when you go into those churches, there are people there that are not in line with what people were saying. So it's not always a collective belief. And so we have to continue to work to make sure that we are abiding by what we're saying, what we're doing, because those are the principles that we want to live collectively by. That's what our church polity, that's what our church identity is created around. And as we enter into this next 100 years, it'll be important what those religious institutions, a lot of them are falling by the wayside. A lot of them are not as well attended as we can see in places like this, where there's good intention and there's good work being done, but there's not a lot of fellowship, a lot of people following and coming and really depending on the church for their advocacy and work. It's interesting, in the United States this past week, Pope Leo's bishop that he appointed was in Los Angeles walking people to their immigration hearing and outside of that. And that was to be in the way of the ICE officials that were taking people and deporting them. And so the church has a role. the church had a role in the 1960s with Martin Luther King and others. We had Jewish rabbis, we had different faith group leaders, ministers, and priests who came and supported that work of the communities to fight for their rights. And now when we're living in this time where these things are coming up, where these issues are coming forward, the attacks on trans people, on LGBTQ people, on the different faith groups, especially the Islamophobia against the Muslim community. These things are, I think, opportunities for us to live out that promise that was being, I think, addressed in those 1960s times. I grew up during that time period in the 1970s and saw the rise of the indigenous Indian religion movement. So it's an Indian ecumenical movement that happened at Morley. And during that time, we had about, it grew over time. It was there from 1971 to 1985. And during that time, we had the Smithsonian came in and did a documentary. The CBC through Man Alive did a documentary. Others came and talked to the people who were coming. A lot from young people from the urban centers, some from Chicago or Los Angeles or from Toronto, and others from the remote communities that were dealing with a lot, but they had their spiritual leaders come to Morley to take part together to share in ceremony, but also to share in perspectives, because they talked a lot about what we believe and what we understand and how we worship, how we practice. So they reintroduced the things like the sweat lodge because people were doing them, but this coming from the gap of knowledge from their ancestors. They were only doing them because there was memory, or someone read a book, or someone started to dabble in our religious practice, and they needed a foundation. So they came to Morley to talk to the elders, to ask them, what does this mean? Why are we doing this? What are we trying to achieve by doing these acts? You sort of think about it when we do things like lighting a Christ candle. So there's different interpretations around that. Different observance is being lent to that. And a lot of times we talk, the particular church, because I was at McDougall Church, we always have like a big Christ candle right, and the minister would light the candle and explain light, Christ being the light of the world, and kind of taking it from there and expanding on that understanding for the people that we are following in this light. We're following through in an illumination about the world that we live in and connecting to that story as we live into our lives here and now. And so there's different traditions around it, different ways that are interpreted from that act. And that's similar to what was happening with the sweat lodge and with the pipe ceremony. So these things began to gain their authenticity, their reasoning, their purpose by having these discussions with the elders and reconnecting to what the tradition was about and why we do certain things and who does it different, because all people have different ways of doing those things. So when you hear someone say it has to be done this way, it's not necessarily that way for all people. And we are a very open people. In our tradition, we don't differentiate between men and women. In some groups, the Cree groups, they have the men sitting on one side, the women sitting on the other side. And it sort of reminds you of sort of Muslim practice, when they have the men in one room and the women in another room. And when we do our things, everything is mixed. Everyone has the right to do whatever practice, so that we don't just have men who are pipe carriers, we have women who are pipe carriers. We don't just have men who are Sundance makers, we have women who are Sundance makers. We have everyone sort of participating in different aspects. We also have an LGBTQ tradition called the Wiyunkte and Wichunkte. Wiyunkte is a woman with a affinity for other women, and Wichunkte is the same sort of for men, and also trans traditions. So our way of understanding God's diversity it continues to evolve. And it's never sort of, we believe one thing and therefore the world is like this. It's always with a wide eye to see what the world is telling us. Being involved in creation, being involved in the land, to see how these connections are affecting us and bringing us to new understanding. So that a lot of it is self-development, self-awareness, and understanding what our place is in this time. That's a large majority of our work. Our faith is based around how we are encountering the world and how that response of the world is telling us about ourselves. What we hear, what we believe, what we understand, as we are instructed by the world around us, either from elders, either from community members or others that speak to us, or the things that we notice in nature, what nature is doing, what nature is teaching. We often talk about nature's university, and that many who have been instructed in that vein are not recognized. So in the academy, they are not given credentialing, they're not given due reverence or accreditation for these beliefs and these understandings that have been passed down. So we consider them experts, we consider them knowledge keepers, we consider them elders that teach us. And so with these efforts, we try to lift up and align what we understand about the world, how we understand the world, and what we have been taught in light of what we are learning from, continuing to learn from the world around us, either as it changes through climate change and other things, or as we gain new knowledge and perspectives from encountering others from a non-Indigenous background. And that includes a lot of the people that are coming today from diverse places that have a lot of different perspectives on how they live in the land. I was recently in Guatemala in August of last year with the Chinook Winds Regional Ministry. And we went down and saw a school that was built by one of our church workers, and her work down there in reaching out to the community. They were feeding elders whose children had left to become migrant workers and were living in precarious conditions. So the grandparents and the parents were left to fend for themselves, and a lot of them were elderly. So they needed particular care, so they had meals set up for them, they had support for them. They lived in very dire conditions with wood stoves and eating wood, and they live a lot in the mountain area, so it's a very hard trek to get around and do things. So different organizations have formed to help, and to help not only the elderly, but to the children that are left behind as well. There are some, especially because the parents are trying to make a living, they have to leave their families behind. There's a monument in one of the towns of a man large statue of a man sort of waving. And it is a monument to all the migrant workers who left the area. And in this particular town, what we were told is that there are no young men left in the town because everyone is taken to go and try to find their fortune, try to make a living and send something back. And so the families grow up in this disruption. And a lot of them have been through a lot because of the history. In Guatemala, they had many civil wars of Mayan against Mayan people, Spanish against Mayan people. This is an ongoing thing where the government is not the friend of the people. In that town that we went to, there was a Starbucks. So it was a fairly affluent town, and people go and take part. But the indigenous people are set up in the little market areas that are forced to sell their things or try to aggressively sell things. And I went into a Starbucks there, and I was sitting there with another minister, and noticed like they had some nice palatial room bigger than this, and had seating and a nice open air courtyard in the back there, and we sort of sat there for a while having our coffee, and noticed you can tell the indigenous people because they all wear the traditional clothing, and it's the woven shirts and dresses that they wear. A lot of the women wear that more than the men. And the children were running in selling little trinkets to the people there. And the workers at the Starbucks had a water bottle, and they would squirt the children like dogs and chase them out of the space. And so this treatment in a land where they are 80% of the population of Mayan people, yet they are, and it's sort of inverted from here where we are less than 5%, 2% of the population as indigenous people. So indigenous people are the majority, and yet they don't have the rights, the access to power or politics the same way that others would. And we went to a hot springs area, which I would not go into because I have a similar reaction to the hot springs here in Banff, where it was a holy place. It was a place of deep contemplation and healing, and now it's turned into a resort. And people go there and they'll have their good time, but for us it is like you're in our church, and you're not necessarily respecting anything that we understand or believe. The Caven Basin, which we call Mini Ruin, is a healing place, like a place of miracles. It was first shown to the CP rail workers in the 1890s. They immediately wrote back to Ottawa about this place, and Ottawa, through John A. MacDonald, declared that site Canada's first national park. And so from that point, we were kicked out of that space, and we were not allowed to go back. We turned it into a resort along the lines of German resorts. And so we had a facility there, a spa, and they had a big pool set up and stuff. And a lot of people, a lot of tourists came in. So it's changed over time. They don't have the big pool anymore, but it still remains a big tourist draw. And we can't go there for the healing waters as we would normally go, or for prayers and stuff. We use the water in different ways in ceremonies, but to come to that area, it's like a desecration. My father described it as like Christ walking into the temple and seeing the money changers. You have the upending ending of the table saying, "You turned my house of worship into a den of thieves." And so that understanding of how we are distanced from our faith places and how we relate to the land is something that is not necessarily a friendly or an understood thing. It's merely one aspect of a history that is being ignored. So we think about these things when we talk about Indigenous Day, we talk about the focus of celebration that has been happening across Canada for a number of years. The initial effort of Indigenous Day came from Morley as a calling from the elders for a day of prayer. They wanted a day of prayer to remember ancestors, to remember family, to remember things that people have gone through, to have a solemn remembrance of what was going on and what we had been through. And this was happening in 1971, just as churches like the Anglican Church and the Presbyterian Church had begun to investigate what the impacts of the residential schools and Christianity had been on the Indigenous population. They wanted to know what impact they had been having. So that question started coming up at that point in earnest, because it was actually put into policy to start addressing some of these and to get recommendations of it. The initial document that was done by the Anglican Church called Beyond Traplines has a number of different recommendations. It was written by a United Church researcher, and he wrote in a number of recommendations of things that they found to sound eerily like the calls to action that we have today. So we've been saying this over and over again for generations of how we need to change and work together. And so some of these efforts have been taken up and others have not. And so when we come to express what Indigenous Day is about as a day of prayer, it is something that is deeply rooted in our practice and how we, the elders wanted us to live out what we believe and how we believe, as opposed to merely celebrating the optics of regaining a powwow practice or something along those lines, to demonstrate and to illustrate for non-Indigenous people. This was more of an internalized commemoration of the individual that had survived, and how do we lift that up as a center of a day of remembrance. A lot of the things that we have been going through, like the missing and murdered women issue or the foster care issue that continues today, are things that we can't address alone. And so as we raise these issues, it's always important to have others come and take part, to hear, to learn, and to be energized to act in response to that. This past March, we had a visit by Murray Wilson, who was one of the commissioners for the TRC, along with Murray Sinclair and Free Guy, I can't remember his name. But the response was very good in Calgary, and one of the things that we introduced there was these oaths to reconciliation, because she had been taking the oaths to the Governor General and others in order to motivate them to become more involved and to act intentionally around some of their commitments that they're saying about reconciliation, to actually make those a reality by putting them into words and putting them into practice, how we would live into our reconciliation commitment. And so those are the kind of things that we are currently working on within the ministry of bringing that awareness and understanding that, yes, that there is a good opportunity to learn, and people have been learning. When we take things like the blanket exercise to different areas, we've actually done one in here. It's a good opportunity to get things in perspective, but it doesn't end there. There is direction and problems that are highlighted that we should think about responding to, or think about how we can make our voice more meaningful by taking steps where we challenge systems. When I think about during the 1920s, 1930s, under the Indian Act, we were not allowed to gather. We were not allowed to associate and have more than one group of people. And through people like John Morley, who helped found the National Indian Brotherhood, the Indian Association of Alberta, as a white person, to advocate for Indigenous people, really took some guts, because during that time in the 1930s, 1940s, to operate as a lawyer under the Indian Act, you could be charged and go to jail, and the Indians that you're working for could be charged and go to jail. So there was no sort of way of justice within that system. It was completely prohibited to support Indigenous people, and yet he did. And yet he spoke up and helped to form organizations and helped to form advocacy. So the advocacy never died, even though it was prohibited, even though it was something that the government didn't want to hear. It's still, through the character of people like John Morley, have importance for our history, because it shows us that we can do much more in spite of the systems that are saying, don't do this, don't do that. I think about that, and when I think about in the States currently, with the efforts to stop a lot of the work abroad through USAID, and how in Africa they were giving life-saving AIDS treatment to people, and once the program was abolished or taken out, the workers just sort of turned off robotically and just left. They didn't bother to think about sort of what is the implication of this. Can we challenge orders? Can we challenge what we're doing? And how do we step into sort of a righteous way of thinking or believing? This happened again with ICE and others that are taking up people and wearing masks and coming into places. And it's like, how can you follow a system that is unjust, that is against even your legal system, and do things that are against your morality, against your way of believing, taking mothers away from children, deporting pregnant women, and that sort of thing. Or even yesterday with the attack in Iran. Not saying that there's no justification around why they did it, or what, because they've been talking about that for 20, 30 years. But to do this without authorization, coming in, doing the bombing, it's sort of, there's no thought to, okay, we are part of a collective, we're part of a society, part of a way of believing, and we should all follow the rules that are set in place. If those that want to break that are doing that, how do we resist? How do we turn against that push? Because that can take us down very dark paths. And if we're going to live in the light, if we're going to live as a society that helps and nurtures one another and aims toward a better future for children and their children, how are we living into that by being robotically sort of inclined to follow orders when we've seen what that approach has done in our past? Are we learning from our past and bringing it into the future? Much like we talk about learning from elders and ancestors and their teachings and try to bring that into now. Are we doing the same in this society? So something to think about. These are just thoughts that are kind of in the air, I think, at this time. And for me, that's what ministry is. It's taking the time to understand that we're not perfect in what we're doing. We have a lot of challenges and a lot of things we have to work through, and we need to talk about it. We need to work through these things together. We need to have an open mind as we step out into the world, as we take part in that, what the world has to offer, and understand that we have impact in our actions, in our advocacy, in our lifestyles, in our politics, and in the way that we enter into these spaces. So I think for me, these are important parts of what it means to be a Christian, what it means to be a person living in this time, and how we will be challenged in the future. And what we do with that challenge says a lot about us, says a lot about who we are and what we believe and what we are taught. I think the more that we see people taking on their own advocacy and working toward a better future for all, I think that's really where the church has tried to position itself. And as we live in that, it's always going to be a precarious place. And I think that as we form our identities out of this time, we need to be very cognizant. I'll just end on this idea of Christina Cleveland. She gave a talk, and there was a group of women who were from an evangelical church in Texas. And they came and talked to her about how they wanted to reach out to Hispanic women and have more of a relationship in their community. And the first thing she asked them was, well, what have you done? And they said, we held a meeting at our church, and we invited them to come, and no one showed up. And she said, well, have you talked to them? Have you seen why that was? And they had, when they did that, they found out that the women couldn't meet at the hour that was convenient for the white women. They wanted to meet at 11 o'clock in the morning at the church, and the women didn't get off their work until 11 o'clock at night after their shifts had ended. And so then they shifted their time to meet with them. They found out at that point that a lot of the women didn't speak English. So then a couple of the women started to learn Spanish, took Spanish classes, learned on apps and different things. And as they continued to hold the space and listen, they learned some of the issues around their healthcare issues, their immigration issues, around the things that they were going through and their families were going through. And they started to then help and advocate on those levels and what the women needed, where they were at. So the point of this is that it was interesting in the reflection from Christina Cleveland to say these women never gave up. Every time they came against a barrier, they blew through it and continued to move in a direction with sort of a faith and an understanding that there was a goal at the end of this, that this hindrance thing that stopped them for the moment wasn't world ending, that they could move beyond this into something and find that next step where this was taking them. And through faith, they really felt a more robust sense of what it means to be a neighbor, be a Christian, be a person who is there to help. And so when she met these women later, they came up to her and they told her that because of their engagement, they felt like they had flesh on their bones. They felt like they were more real, that they had been through a number of different challenges, and they had found themselves in this work. And so that's, to me, the gift of this work, is that we find ourselves, we find our connection, we find our place, our balance, as we work through difficult things. We learn from the challenges. We find a more robust way of being in the world, and we start to develop the tools that we need, not just for ourselves, not just for our community, but for our family life, for our extended family and relationships, things that we take for granted, things that we don't understand. As we learn from the society around us, a lot of times we'll hear instances in the States of the evangelical preacher who suddenly has a gay son or daughter or a trans child, and then they start to see the world differently. Then they start to understand that their perspectives are not informed, that they need to humanize and bring themselves to a new understanding. And so these instances of where we take the world outside, bring it into our lives, and start to live within that space of we are in the wonder of learning from the world around us, learning from one another, and we're internalizing that and making it apply to where we are going and what we believe. To me, those are the keys around how we can move ahead in this time, because we are a multicultural, diverse, multiracial society. And though we don't see it in all places, it's there. And in order to live in that world going forward, we're going to have to recognize where we need to give up certain things. We need to understand different ways. We need to build resiliency for ourselves and for the others that are coming, because we're sharing this space. It is that, at its core, that treaty story of we are here in light of our experience of one another. So we gain strength from that, or we can be isolationists and try to hold back the ocean of people. When the treaties were signed, the Stony people didn't want to have anything to do with the treaties. That's one of our elders talked about that event that we had at McDougall Church, the one that burned down and they rebuilt. And one of the things that he talked about was how it was important to remember that we didn't really buy into everything that we were being told. But if you look on the plaque at the church beside the grave of George McDougall, there's a plaque there that talks about how the McDougals were surprised to see the Stonies practicing the Sabbath even without a minister. For 30 years they were still practicing Christians, but they had no minister, they had nobody teaching them. They were teaching themselves, they were learning from the Cree Bible and other things that were these stories that they integrated into their faith, into their practice, into their sweat lodges, into their pipe ceremonies, that calling of Jesus and connection to a type of faith there. when the next plaque said that the Stonies had been debating whether or not to become part of the treaty, it was Kichipuat, who was my ancestor, who convinced them by saying an ocean of people will be coming. We cannot resist sort of that change. We have to find a way to live within that and to express who we are at that point. So he convinced them that it was better to be a part of the treaty relationship and to live that out, live out that potential, rather than to fight against those that were coming. Because then, in an adversarial relationship, we would just get wiped out. We would no longer exist. So this forethought of working together became very important. And that's really another of the foundations. Foundation of believing everyone has a right to exist and believe in the way that they want. And this idea that we are all bound together in this creation, in this society, that we have a means to figure things out together and to live in a more positive light because of what we have been through, what we have shared collectively, and where we're going in terms of our vision for the future. So I'm going to end there, and I'll see if you have any questions or anything, but you want to hit the off button?
Okay.
Yeah, thanks. It's 11:30.
Microphone.
Yeah.
Just turn that off.